They said the elk were gone, every last one. Hunters hadn't cut fresh tracks in years, and by 1873, even the county records had stopped mentioning elk at all, the way a place stops talking about anything it's decided is finished. Everyone believed that, except Cyrus Farrow. Every spring, before sunrise, he climbed the same ridge carrying a sack of salt to a forgotten spring nobody else bothered visiting anymore. People called him stubborn. Some called him lonely. Neither word bothered him enough to stop. After Cyrus Farrow died, a small band of elk kept returning to that same spring for another 20 years. This isn't a story about extinction so much as it's a story about what a man does with the years he has left after he's decided he owes something he can't repay outright. Cyrus had been one of the finest hunters in that valley once, in the years before the war. He'd made a good part of his living supplying elk meat to 2 counties, back when elk still ran in numbers worth hunting. And he'd been proud of the work in the plain way a man is proud of something he's genuinely good at. He could read a game trail better than most men twice his age, and by his mid-20s he'd built a reputation as the surest shot on that stretch of ridge, the kind of reputation that brought other hunters out to learn from him rather than compete against him. He wasn't cruel about it. He took what the valley needed, and no more, the way most careful hunters did. But he took his share, year after year, same as everyone else who hunted that range, and none of them thought much at the time about what all those shares added up to. Nobody in the valley blamed the hunters afterward, not directly. It was simpler and truer in its way to say that too many people had taken too much for too long without any one person doing anything obviously wrong, the way a resource disappears sometimes, not through a single act of greed, but through years of ordinary use that nobody stopped to add up until there was nothing left to count. The war took Cyrus away for the better part of 4 years, and it gave back a different man than the one it took. He served with a Missouri regiment through fighting he rarely spoke of afterward, and whatever he saw in those years, he brought most of it home locked behind a quiet that hadn't been part of him before. Men who served alongside him said, on the rare occasions the subject came up at all, that Cyrus had been steady under fire in a way that surprised even veterans who'd known him only as a hunter, and that whatever changed in him afterward hadn't been cowardice or breakdown so much as some private accounting he'd started keeping and never fully put down again. His wife died of a fever during his 2nd year gone, nursed by neighbors who did what they could and buried her before Cyrus ever got word she'd taken sick. By the time a letter reached him with the news, months had already passed, and he came home eventually to an empty cabin and a grave he hadn't been there to dig, in a valley that had gone on without him the way valleys do. He visited that grave often in his 1st year back, neighbors said, more often than most widowers managed, though he never spoke about her by name to anyone outside his own house, and people learned quickly enough not to ask. Something in him had gone quiet in a way that never fully came back. He rarely hunted after that. People said he'd lost his taste for it in the war, the way a lot of men did, and left it there, since it was as good an explanation as any, and asked nothing further of him. What almost nobody understood, for a long while, was that Cyrus had started spending his springs doing something else entirely, climbing that same ridge before dawn, alone, for reasons he never once explained to anyone who asked. The spring after he came home for good, Cyrus found elk tracks on that ridge, fresh enough that the edges hadn't softened overnight. It should have been impossible. The valley had settled years earlier on the plain fact that the herds were finished, hunted too hard for too long, the last confirmed sighting nearly a decade back. Nobody left who claimed to have seen so much as a track since. Cyrus knew as well as anyone how that emptiness had come about. He'd helped bring it on, in his way, long before it was finished. He crouched over the tracks a long while before following them, turning the ground over in his mind, the way any experienced hunter would, checking the depth and freshness twice before letting himself believe what his own eyes were telling him. He'd tracked elk his whole working life. He knew what a fresh print looked like, and knew, too, how easy it would have been to talk himself into seeing one where none existed, after years of hoping quietly that some remnant of the herd might still be out there somewhere past where anyone had bothered looking. He followed the tracks anyway, up past the tree line to a spring most people in the valley had forgotten existed at all, tucked into a fold of the mountain that took the better part of a morning to reach on foot. What he found there was 6 elk, a cow, 2 younger animals, and 3 more he took a while to sort out, standing at the spring's edge, watching him the way wild game watches anything unfamiliar, wary but not yet fled. He stood at the tree line himself for the better part of an hour, not moving, watching them the way he might once have watched a herd he meant to hunt, though hunting was the furthest thing from his mind that morning. 6 elk, in a valley that had spent nearly a decade certain there wasn't a single one left standing. He thought about what it would mean to walk back down and tell the first person he met. He thought, too, about what 6 elk amounted to against a whole county that had once counted them by the 100, and about his own hand in getting the number down that low. He didn't tell anyone. He turned around, walked back down the mountain, and said nothing to a single soul in the valley about what he'd seen, though several people noticed he'd taken to disappearing up that ridge with some regularity that spring, and assumed, since it was Cyrus, that it was simply one more of his quiet habits. What he did instead of telling anyone was start tending the place. Every spring morning he set out for that ridge. He stopped first at his wife's grave on the low rise behind the cabin and left a single wildflower there, whatever the season had managed to offer that early, a violet some years, once nothing but a sprig of henbit when a late frost had killed everything better. He never explained the habit to anyone, and no one in the valley ever saw him do it more than once or twice by accident, catching him at it from a distance before he noticed and moved on. It was, as far as anyone could tell, a private thing between him and her, and it stayed that way. He carried salt up in a burlap sack every few weeks that first year, packing it into a hollow near the spring the way a man salts a lick for cattle, though there wasn't a hoof of cattle anywhere near that ridge. He cleared deadfall off the game trail after every hard storm, work that took him most of a day, and that he did alone, without complaint. By his second year he'd built a small lean-to of scrap timber near the spring, just enough shelter to sit out sudden weather without having to make the long climb back down, and he kept it stocked, in a quiet way, with dried meat and a spare blanket, as though he expected to spend a great many mornings up there in the years ahead. When a pair of younger hunters mentioned, within his hearing at the mill, that they meant to hunt that stretch of ridge come fall, Cyrus talked them out of it, without ever saying why. Told them the terrain up there was worse than it looked, that he'd twisted an ankle badly on it himself 2 years running, which wasn't entirely a lie, since he had in fact twisted his ankle on that ground once. He offered to show them better ground 2 ridges over instead, and spent an entire afternoon walking them through it, just to keep them off the one stretch of mountain that mattered. People in the valley thought he was wasting his time on empty ground, and mostly let him do it, the way a valley lets a quiet, grieving man have his peculiarities without much comment. Nobody connected his spring disappearances to the missing elk herd, mostly because nobody imagined there was still a herd left to connect them to. If stories like this find you on the road home, subscribe and ride along. New stories every week, waiting at the trailhead. What began to happen at that spring over the following few years was harder to explain away as one man's private grief project, once a few more people started noticing it. The elk stopped fleeing when Cyrus arrived, not gradually growing bolder the way game sometimes does around a harmless, familiar presence. By the 3rd spring, they simply didn't run anymore, standing at the spring's edge while he packed salt into the lick not 30 yards off, watching him with the same wary patience they'd have shown any other fixture of that ground, like a fallen log or a rock outcrop that had always been there. He could walk within 20 yards of the cow and her calves some mornings before any of them so much as shifted their weight, a distance that would have sent any ordinary wild elk crashing off through the timber the moment he came into view. One bull in particular, older and heavier than the rest, took to holding a position on the ridge above the spring most mornings Cyrus visited, never approaching, never retreating, simply standing at the tree line watching the whole scene play out below him, the way an old animal watches something it has decided, correctly or not, poses it no threat. Cyrus mentioned the bull to no one for years, though he noted its presence in his own private way. Coming to think of the mornings, it didn't appear as somehow incomplete, though he never fully explained even to himself why that should matter. Whether the bull was doing anything more deliberate than simple habituation, nobody who saw it could rightly say. Wild elk grow accustomed to a consistent, non-threatening source of salt the way any game animal will, and a herd fed regularly enough by the same man in the same spot for years running will often lose most of its instinctive weariness toward that one person specifically without losing it toward anyone else. That was well understood by anyone who'd worked livestock or game long enough. What it didn't explain, at least not fully, was why that particular bull chose to stand watch rather than simply feed and move on the way the rest of the herd did. There was one other detail Cyrus noted in passing, years later, that never made much sense to him or to anyone he eventually mentioned it to. The herd arrived at that spring within a day or two of the same calendar date nearly every spring he tended it, whether the winter before it had been hard or mild, long or short. A late thaw seemed to make no real difference to the timing. He kept no formal record of it, beyond a few scattered notes, and never claimed to understand what governed it, only that it held steady enough, year after year, to notice. Word got out eventually, the way anything does in a valley small enough that everyone knows everyone's habits. A boy out chasing a lost dog stumbled onto the spring one autumn and came back down the mountain talking about elk, real elk, more of them than he could easily count. And within a season the whole valley had heard some version of what Cyrus Farrow had apparently known and kept to himself for years. The reaction wasn't what Cyrus might have hoped for. Younger hunters, hearing there was a live herd on that ridge after all, went looking for it themselves, eager for a hunt nobody thought was possible anymore. They searched the whole mountain over more than one autumn, working the same stretch of ridge Cyrus climbed every spring, and never once found so much as a fresh track. One young man swore he'd found the exact spring the boy had described, only to report there was nothing there but bare rock and a trickle of water not worth the climb. Only Cyrus ever found them, every spring, at the same forgotten spring, as though the herd had decided, in whatever way animals decide such things, that he alone among the valley's hunters was safe to be found by. People started teasing him about it at the mill and at church, not unkindly at first. "Still waiting on your ghosts, Farrow?" became something close to a standing joke, repeated often enough that Cyrus stopped bothering to answer it directly, only nodding or saying nothing at all, which some people took as confirmation that the old man had simply lost the thread of the thing entirely, chasing elk that either didn't exist or existed only for him. A few of the younger men, growing frustrated after a second failed season of searching, suggested outright that Cyrus was leading them deliberately astray, protecting some secret hunting ground for himself, though nobody who knew him well believed Cyrus capable of that particular kind of selfishness, whatever else they made of his strange springtime habits. As Cyrus grew older, he talked less, and what he did say grew stranger. A neighbor stopping by one evening in his final years found him sitting on the porch well after dark and asked, more out of concern than curiosity, what he was doing out there alone in the cold. Cyrus only said, "They know," and offered nothing further, leaving the neighbor to wonder, the way people in that valley had wondered about him for decades by then, whether that was the talk of an old man's mind finally slipping, or something else he simply didn't have the words or the will to explain any further. The same neighbor mentioned the exchange to a few others afterward, and it made its way around the valley the way any piece of strange talk from an old solitary man eventually does, gaining small embellishments with each retelling. Some said Cyrus had been talking about the war, about men he'd served with who hadn't come home. Others said he'd meant the elk plainly enough, and that there was nothing stranger in it than an old man convinced, in his final years, that some animal on a mountain understood something about him that no person in the valley ever had. Nobody pressed him on it, By then the valley had long since decided that whatever Cyrus Farrow did up on that mountain every spring was his business and nobody else's, and the stranger his talk became, the less anyone wanted to be the one who challenged it directly. A few of the older women in the valley took to leaving a plate of food on his porch some evenings that final winter. A small kindness nobody made a show of, since everyone could see well enough that he was failing, without anyone quite willing to say so to his face. That last spring, Cyrus made the climb slower than he ever had, stopping twice to catch his breath on ground he'd have crossed without noticing 20 years earlier. When he came over the last rise before the spring, the bull was already there, standing at the tree line, in the exact spot it always held, as though it had been waiting rather than simply arriving the way it always had. Cyrus stopped where he was and didn't come any closer. Neither did the bull. For a long while, neither of them moved at all, the old man and the old animal, watching each other across the same 30 yards that had separated them for the better part of 2 decades, while the sky behind the ridge went from gray to gold, and the rest of the small herd drank quietly at the spring below. Cyrus never told anyone what passed between them that morning, if anything did. He simply packed his salt into the lick as he always had, and made the long climb back down, and never spoke of that particular morning again to a living soul. Cyrus Farrow died in his sleep one winter, quietly, the way old men sometimes do, after a life that had asked more of them than most people ever knew. Neighbors found him peacefully gone, the cabin undisturbed, nothing about his final days suggesting he'd known the end was close, though a few who'd seen him that final autumn said afterward that he'd seemed, in some way none of them could quite name, like a man settling his accounts. He'd given away most of his remaining tools that fall, mended every fence on the property that needed it, and paid off a small debt at the mill he hadn't been pressed to settle, small tidying acts that made sense only in hindsight. Spring came, and nobody expected anything in particular from it. The valley had buried Cyrus with the quiet respect it gave most of its old, solitary men, and moved on the way valleys do, the joke about his ghosts already fading from conversation now that there was no one left to tease about it. Then a young man walking cattle up the lower slope that April found fresh elk tracks at the old spring. The same spring, the same season, the same pattern Cyrus Farrow had kept alone for 2 decades, now continuing without him. He didn't believe what he was looking at first, and rode 2 miles out of his way to fetch a second man before either of them would trust their own account of it enough to tell anyone else. It kept continuing, every spring after that, for 20 more years. The same small herd, or a herd descended from it, appeared at that spring each year at dawn, and nowhere else on the mountain that anyone could ever find, no matter how many seasons a curious hunter spent looking. Hunters who remembered the old joke about Cyrus's ghosts began avoiding that stretch of ridge out of a mix of genuine unease and something closer to respect, an unspoken agreement that whatever ground had belonged to Cyrus Farrow ought to stay his, even 20 years gone. A few tried, in the early years after his death, to take up something like his old habit themselves, carrying salt up the same trail in hopes of drawing the herd closer or learning more about it, and found the elk no more willing to tolerate a stranger's presence than they'd ever been before Cyrus first found them. Proof, to the people who noticed it, that whatever had built up between the man and that herd hadn't simply transferred to the next person willing to climb the mountain. Children who grew up in the valley in those decades took in the story the way children take in most local lore, rarely questioning where exactly it had come from or how much of it was true in every detail. That the elk kept Cyrus Farrow's appointment every spring, whether or not anyone understood why, and that the ridge above the old spring belonged to him still, in whatever way a dead man can be said to own anything. An old-timer named Wendell Pace, who'd hunted alongside Cyrus as a young man before the war, and had known him about as well as anyone left alive still did, eventually found the piece of the story the valley had never had, Cyrus's own journal, discovered among his few belongings by a nephew clearing out the cabin years after his death, and passed along to Pace, who'd asked after it more out of respect than any real expectation of learning something new. Pace had his own memories of hunting alongside Cyrus decades before any of this, back when both of them were young men still building their reputations on that same range. And he remembered clearly the kind of hunter Cyrus had been before the war changed him. Steady, exacting, proud of his work in a way that never tipped into arrogance. The two of them had once tracked a wounded buck together for the better part of 2 days, taking turns reading sign neither one could quite agree on, and Pace still counted that hunt among the finest pieces of tracking he'd ever witnessed, long before either of them had any reason to think about what all that skill would eventually cost the herds they depended on. It made the later years harder for Pace to square, a man who'd once helped thin that herd toward nothing, spending the back half of his life trying, in his own quiet and unannounced way, to undo some small piece of it. Most of the journal was ordinary enough: weather, small farm notes, the plain record-keeping of a solitary man's days. But scattered through the later years were entries about the spring, brief and unadorned, that told Pace more than 30 years of valley talk ever had. One read simply, "Saw them again today. 6 left now. Lord forgive me for helping make them so few." Another, written some years later, after the herd had grown past what Cyrus had first found. "They don't run from me anymore. Wish I could say I'd earned that. Wish I could say I know why." The final entry, written in a hand grown shakier with age, read, "If they still come after I'm gone, maybe they'll know I meant it." Pace sat with that last line a long while before he ever showed the journal to anyone else in the valley, turning it over the way he might turn over an unfamiliar track, trying to decide exactly what Cyrus had meant to say and how much of it was meant for the elk at all, rather than for himself. It was, in the end, the closest thing the valley ever got to understanding what Cyrus Farrow had spent the last 30 years of his life doing on that mountain, and why. The herd kept its pattern for 2 full decades after Cyrus died, until a violent spring flood reshaped that whole stretch of mountain in a single night, tearing loose timber, rerouting the small creek that fed the spring, and burying the old game trail under a slide of rock and mud that took a full season to settle. Men who went up afterward to assess the damage to the wider ridge, mostly concerned with timber loss rather than any elk, reported that the whole face of that section of mountain looked changed enough that a man who'd known it his whole life might have had trouble placing exactly where the old trail used to run. The spring itself shifted, the water finding a new course lower on the slope, and the old trail leading up to where it used to sit disappeared under debris that nobody in the valley had the reason or the manpower to clear away, the way Cyrus once had, year after year, for no reward anyone could ever point to. That spring, for the first time in over 40 years counting Cyrus's own tending of the place, the elk did not return. A few people climbed up that April out of simple curiosity, expecting to find the herd relocated to whatever new water the flood had exposed nearby. They found nothing, no fresh tracks anywhere on that stretch of ridge, not at the old spring's buried location, not at the new course the water had carved, not anywhere else on the mountain that a search party covered that spring or the next. Some folks in the valley said, plainly enough, that the old spring had simply dried up in its old location and the herd had gone looking for water elsewhere, the way any animal would, and that a new water source somewhere beyond the valley's usual hunting range would explain the sudden absence well enough without needing anything stranger attached to it. Others believed the small band had simply run its course after 4 decades, dying out the way any isolated, thinly populated herd eventually does, flood or no flood, the timing just happening to land the same year the ground gave way. Wendell Pace, by then an old man himself and one of the last people left who'd known Cyrus Farrow as a young hunter before any of this happened, disagreed with both explanations when asked, though he never claimed to have a better one to offer in their place. "Maybe they just came long enough," he said, "to make sure nobody forgot him." No one in that valley ever found another elk track in those hills, not that year, not in all the years since, but every spring, for a long while afterward, people still climbed that ridge and left a handful of salt beside the flat stones where Cyrus Farrow used to sit and wait for daylight, just in case something was still listening for it, somewhere on that mountain, Whether or not anyone left alive could say for certain what